The thick plumes of smoke billowed up from the grill, casting an ominous shadow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Greg glanced nervously at the line of houses lining the street, half expecting an angry mob to come charging out at any moment. He'd been looking forward to this barbecue for weeks, an afternoon of grilled burgers, cold beers, and quality time with his son, Jason, the newly promoted fire chief. But as the acrid smell wafted through the air, Greg knew trouble was brewing. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of an official vehicle pulled into the driveway. Greg's heart sank as he recognized the HOA president, Karen, storming towards him, her face twisted in rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, waving a neatly typed letter in his face. "Your barbecue is in clear violation of our community guidelines." Greg tried to interject, but Karen steamrolled on, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "The smoke, the odors, it's a nuisance and a health hazard. I've already received multiple complaints from your neighbors." Jason emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Is there a problem, Dad?" he asked, brow furrowed in concern. "Your father is flagrantly disregarding our rules," Karen spat, rounding on Jason. "As the fire chief, I would have expected you to know better than to enable this kind of behavior." Jason's expression hardened. "Hold on a minute, Karen. My dad is well within his rights to have a barbecue on his own property. Not when it's causing a disturbance," Karen shot back. "This is a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood, and we will not tolerate this kind of nuisance." Greg tried to interject, but Jason raised a hand, silencing him. "Look, Karen, I understand your concerns, but this is my dad's home. He has every right to enjoy a barbecue if he wants to." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "Well then, as the HOA president, I'm telling you to shut it down. Now." She thrust the letter towards Greg. "You have 24 hours to comply, or will be forced to take legal action." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her car, leaving Greg and Jason staring after her in stunned silence. "I can't believe this," Greg muttered, running a hand through his hair. "She's really going to try and shut down my barbecue." Jason's jaw was set in a hard line. "Don't worry, Dad. I'm not going to let her bully you like this." He placed a reassuring hand on Greg's shoulder. "We're going to fight this, no matter what it takes." Greg felt a surge of pride and relief, but also a twinge of concern. He knew his son's position as fire chief gave him a certain amount of leverage, but he also didn't want Jason to jeopardize his career over this. "Jason, I appreciate you wanting to help, but I don't want you to get in trouble with the HOA or the department," he said. "Maybe we can try to reason with Karen, see if we can come to some kind of compromise." Jason shook his head stubbornly. "No way, Dad. She's way out of line here, and I'm not going to let her walk all over you." He clenched his fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "This is personal now." Greg could see the determination in his son's eyes, and he knew there was no talking him down. He sighed heavily, bracing himself for the battle ahead. The next morning, Greg and Jason sat at the kitchen table, poring over the HOA's community guidelines. They'd spent the better part of the evening researching their options, but every avenue seemed to lead to a dead end. "This is ridiculous," Jason growled, slamming his hand on the table. "There's nothing in here about prohibiting barbecues. It's our property, for crying out loud." Greg nodded wearily. "I know, son, but you know how the HOA can be. They'll find some loophole to try and shut us down." Jason's brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay, well, what about the fire department regulations? Surely they can't tell me how to run my own grill on my own land." "I don't know, Jason," Greg said, rubbing his temples. "You know how sensitive the HOA is about anything that might threaten property values. They'll probably claim it's a fire hazard or something." Just then, the doorbell rang, and Greg's heart sank. He exchanged a worried glance with Jason before heading to the front door. Standing on the porch was a somber-faced man in a suit, holding a thick envelope. "Mr. Simmons," he said, "I have a cease and desist order for you from the Homeowners Association." Greg's stomach twisted into knots as he took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he muttered, closing the door and returning to the kitchen. Jason's eyes widened as Greg handed him the envelope. "They didn't waste any time, did they?" he growled, ripping it open. Greg watched anxiously as Jason scanned the document, his expression darkening with each passing second. "This is unbelievable," he said, slamming the papers down on the table. "They're threatening to fine us thousands of dollars if we don't shut down the barbecue by tomorrow afternoon." Greg felt a wave of panic wash over him. Thousands of dollars? "Jason, we can't afford that kind of fine. We'll have to call it off." "No way, Dad," Jason said, his jaw set in a determined line. "I'm not going to let them bully us like this. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." Greg could see the fire in his son's eyes, but he couldn't help but worry about the consequences. "Jason, I know you want to help, but I don't want you to jeopardize your job or get us into legal trouble. Maybe we should just comply and try to negotiate with them later." Jason shook his head vehemently. "No, Dad, this is about more than just a barbecue. It's about standing up to their petty little rules and their abuse of power. We're not going to back down, not this time." Greg could see that there was no talking his son down. Jason was a man of principle, and he wasn't about to let the HOA trample all over them. Greg sighed heavily, knowing that he was about to be swept up in a battle that he never wanted any part of. "All right, Jason," he said, resigned. "If you're sure about this, then I'm with you. But promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt." Jason nodded, a determined gleam in his eye. "Don't worry, Dad. I've got this. We're going to show that HOA president just who she's messing with." Greg could only hope that his son was right. The next day, as the clock ticked closer to the HOA's deadline, Greg and Jason stood their ground, firing up the grill and preparing for the impending confrontation. Jason had spent the morning making a few strategic phone calls, and Greg could sense the quiet confidence radiating from his son. Whatever plan he had in mind, Greg just hoped it would be enough to stave off the HOA's threatened legal action. Right on cue, the familiar sound of Karen's SUV pulled into the driveway, and Greg felt his stomach twist with dread. Bracing himself, he watched as the HOA president stormed up the path, her eyes blazing with fury. "I see you two have decided to defy our order," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Well, I can assure you, this is not going to end well for you." Jason stepped forward, his posture calm and collected. "Karen, I understand your concerns, but this is my father's private property, and he has the right to use it as he sees fit." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "That's where you're wrong, Jason. As the fire chief, you should know better than to allow such a flagrant violation of our community standards." "Actually, Karen," Jason said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "that's where you're mistaken. As the fire chief, I can say with absolute certainty that this barbecue is perfectly safe and within all applicable regulations." Greg watched in stunned silence as Jason pulled a thick stack of papers from his pocket and handed them to Karen. "These are the official fire department guidelines for residential barbecues. As you can see, our setup here is in full compliance." Karen's face contorted with rage as she flipped through the documents, her fingers trembling. This is preposterous," she sputtered. "You're using your position to undermine the authority of the HOA." Jason shook his head calmly. "Not at all, Karen. I'm simply ensuring that my father's rights as a homeowner are respected. The fire department has no issue with this barbecue, and neither should the HOA." Greg could see the wheels turning in Karen's mind as she struggled to find a loophole. But Jason had clearly done his homework. Frustrated, she turned to Greg, her expression filled with malice. "Well, if the fire department won't help us, then we'll just have to take this to the courts," she hissed. I can assure you, Mr. Simmons, that this is far from over." With that, she spun on her heel and storched back to her car, peeling out of the driveway in a cloud of gravel and dust. Greg let out a long, shaky breath, his heart still pounding. "Wow, Jason, I have to hand it to you. That was some quick thinking." Jason grinned, clapping a hand on his father's shoulder. "I told you we'd show that HOA president who she's dealing with. Nobody messes with the Simmons men and gets away with it." Greg couldn't help but smile, feeling a swell of pride in his son's unwavering determination. But as they turned back to the grill, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The following week, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Word of the Simmons standoff with the HOA had spread like wildfire, and Greg could feel the resentful stares of his neighbors as he went about his daily routine. Karen, true to her word, had made good on her threat to take the matter to court. Greg and Jason had received a summons to appear before the local judge, and they spent the days leading up to the hearing poring over legal documents and strategizing their defense. "I can't believe she's taking us to court over a barbecue," Greg said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "This is completely ridiculous." Jason nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I know, Dad, but we can't let her bully us like this. We've got the law on our side, and we're going to use it to our advantage." Greg couldn't help but admire his son's unwavering confidence, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. The HOA had deep pockets and a team of lawyers at their disposal, and Greg couldn't help but wonder if they were in over their heads. As the day of the hearing arrived, Greg and Jason made their way to the courthouse, bracing themselves for the battle ahead. The courtroom was packed, with Karen and a contingent of her fellow HOA members filling the front rows. The judge, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, took her seat and surveyed the room with a critical eye. "All right, let's get this started. Mr. Simmons, you're here on a complaint filed by the Homeowners Association. Is that correct?" Greg cleared his throat nervously. "Yes, Your Honor. The HOA is trying to shut down a barbecue I was having on my own property." Karen stood up, her expression smug. "Your Honor, the Simmons barbecue is a clear violation of our community guidelines. It's a nuisance and a fire hazard, and we have the right to enforce our rules." Jason rose to his feet, his voice calm and measured. "Your Honor, my father's barbecue is completely within the bounds of the law. As the fire chief, I can attest that it poses no safety risk whatsoever." The judge's eyes narrowed as she regarded Jason. "And how exactly does your position as fire chief give you the authority to override the HOA's rules?" Jason pulled a thick folder from his briefcase and handed it to the judge. "Your Honor, the fire department has clear guidelines for residential barbecues, and my father's setup is in full compliance. The HOA has no legal grounds to shut this down." The judge leafed through the documents, her expression unreadable. Greg held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the judge looked up, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "Well, it seems to me that the HOA is overstepping its bounds here. Unless you can provide clear evidence of a genuine safety or nuisance issue, I'm inclined to rule in favor of the Simmons." Karen's face flushed with anger, but she remained silent as the judge continued. "This barbecue can proceed as planned, and the HOA is to cease and desist any further legal action." "Understood." Greg felt a surge of relief, but he knew the battle was far from over. As they left the courthouse, he couldn't help but wonder what Karen had up her sleeve next. In the days following the court victory, Greg and Jason found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny from their neighbors. The HOA's defeat had clearly stung, and Greg could feel the resentment and hostility radiating from the other homeowners. Karen, in particular, seemed to have it out for the Simmons family. Greg would catch her glaring at him from across the street, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Whenever he ventured out to check the mail or mow the lawn, he half expected her to come storming over with another cease and desist order. But despite the tension, Greg and Jason refused to back down. They went about their business, hosting the barbecue as planned and even inviting some of their more friendly neighbors over for burgers and beers. The event was a resounding success, and Greg couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in a defiance of the HOA's petty rules. However, their triumph was short-lived. A few days later, Greg arrived home to find a flyer taped to his front door. An announcement for an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for that very evening. "Oh no," Greg muttered, his stomach twisting with dread. "What now?" Jason, who had been waiting for him on the porch, stepped forward, his expression grim. "I have a feeling this isn't going to be good, Dad. Karen's probably got something nasty up her sleeve." Greg sighed heavily. "Well, I guess we better go find out what she's up to." As they made their way to the community center, Greg couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The air was thick with tension, and he could see the other homeowners casting wary glances in their direction. When they arrived, Karen was already standing at the front of the room, her face flushed with indignation. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice dripping with disdain. "As you all know, the Simmons have been flagrantly disregarding our community guidelines, and the HOA has been forced to take legal action." Greg felt a pang of anger, but he remained silent, waiting for Karen to continue. "Now, while the court may have ruled in their favor, I can assure you that this is far from over," Karen said, her eyes narrowing. "We have uncovered some rather concerning information about the Simmons property, and I believe it's time we take a closer look." Greg felt his heart skip a beat. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Karen's lips curled into a malicious smile. "It seems that your precious barbecue grill is actually located on community property, Mr. Simmons. And according to our bylaws, that means it has to go." Greg felt the color drain from his face as the other homeowners erupted into a chorus of angry murmurs. Jason stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "That's ridiculous, Karen," he growled. "You know damn well that grill has been on our property for years. This is just another one of your petty attempts to harass my family." Karen's smile only widened. "Well then, I suppose we'll just have to take this back to court, won't we?" Greg felt a surge of panic as he realized that the battle was far from over. Whatever Karen had up her sleeve, it was clear that she was determined to bring the Simmons family to their knees. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and heated confrontations. Karen and the HOA had made good on their threat, filing a new lawsuit that claimed the Simmons barbecue grill was encroaching on community property. Greg and Jason pored over property records and surveyors' maps, desperately trying to prove that the grill was well within the boundaries of their own land. But Karen had enlisted a team of lawyers who seemed to have an answer for every argument. "This is insane," Greg muttered, rubbing his temples in frustration. "How can they possibly claim that our grill is on their property? It's been there for years." Jason sighed heavily. "I don't know, Dad. But you can bet that Karen and her cronies are going to pull out all the stops to try and take us down." The court date loomed, and Greg found himself consumed by a growing sense of dread. The stakes were higher than ever, and he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what they did, the HOA was going to find a way to win. As the day of the hearing arrived, Greg and Jason made their way to the courthouse, bracing themselves for the battle ahead. The courtroom was once again packed, with Karen and her team of lawyers occupying the front rows. The judge, the same stern-faced woman from the previous case, took her seat and surveyed the room. "All right, let's get started. Mr. Simmons, you're here again on a complaint filed by the Homeowners Association. Is that correct?" Greg cleared his throat nervously. "Yes, Your Honor. They're claiming that my barbecue grill is on community property, and they're trying to force me to remove it." Karen stood up, her expression smug. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The Simmons grill is encroaching on our common area, and it's a violation of our community guidelines. We have a responsibility to our residents to enforce our rules and protect our property values." Jason stood up, his voice firm and unwavering. Your Honor, the Simmons family has owned this property for over 20 years, and that grill has been in the same spot the entire time. There's no way it's on community land. The judge's eyes narrowed as she considered the arguments. Well, it seems we have a bit of a dispute over property boundaries here. I'm going to need to see some detailed surveys and land records before I can make a ruling. Greg felt a glimmer of hope, but he knew that the battle was far from over. Karen and her team of lawyers were relentless, and they seemed determined to do whatever it took to shut down the Simmons barbecue. As the hearing dragged on, Greg could feel the tension in the room escalating. Karen's lawyers presented reams of documents, each one seemingly more convoluted and confusing than the last. Greg felt like he was drowning in a sea of legal jargon, and he could see the judge's patience beginning to wear thin. Finally, after hours of arguments and cross-examinations, the judge raised a hand, silencing the room. All right, I've heard enough. I'm going to need some time to review all of this evidence before I can make a decision. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks' time. Greg felt a wave of relief, but he knew that the fight was far from over. As they left the courthouse, he exchanged a worried glance with Jason, both of them wondering what the next 2 weeks would hold. The 2 weeks leading up to the next court hearing were a blur of stress and uncertainty for Greg and Jason. They spent countless hours poring over property records, trying to find any scrap of evidence that would bolster their case against the HOA's claims. Greg couldn't help but feel a growing sense of despair as the days ticked by. Karen and her team of lawyers seemed to have an endless supply of resources and legal maneuvers, and he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what they did, the HOA was going to find a way to win. Jason, on the other hand, remained steadfast in his determination. He spent hours on the phone, calling in favors from his colleagues in the fire department and reaching out to local politicians and community leaders for support. We can't give up now, Dad, Jason would say, his eyes burning with conviction. We've come too far to let Karen and her cronies push us around. Greg admired his son's unwavering spirit, but he couldn't help but worry about the toll it was taking on both of them. The stress of the legal battle was weighing heavily on their shoulders, and Greg found himself losing sleep as he lay awake, wondering what the future held. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, Greg and Jason made their way to the courthouse, bracing themselves for the battle ahead. As they entered the courtroom, Greg couldn't help but notice the smug expression on Karen's face, and he felt a chill run down his spine. The judge took her seat, her expression unreadable. All right, let's get started. Mr. Simmons, you're here again on a complaint filed by the Homeowners Association. Is that correct? Greg cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. Yes, Your Honor. They're claiming that my barbecue grill is on community property, and they're trying to force me to remove it. Karen stood up, her expression triumphant. Your Honor, after a thorough review of the property records and a new survey of the land, it's clear that the Simmons barbecue grill is indeed encroaching on our common area. We have an obligation to enforce our community guidelines and protect the property values of our residents. Greg felt his heart sink as Jason rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The Simmons family has owned this property for over 2 decades, and that grill has been in the same spot the entire time. Karen and the HOA are trying to bully us out of our own home. The judge held up a hand, silencing Jason. I understand your frustration, Mr. Simmons, but the evidence presented by the HOA seems to be quite compelling. The survey clearly shows that the grill is on community property. Greg felt a surge of panic as he realized that they were on the verge of losing. He glanced over at Jason, whose face was twisted in a look of pure anguish. Your Honor, please, Greg pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. This grill has been a part of our family for years. It's not just a piece of property, it's a symbol of the memories we've created here. You can't take that away from us. The judge's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, Greg dared to hope that she might rule in their favor. But then she shook her head, her voice grave. "I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons, but the law is clear. The grill is on community property, and the HOA is within its rights to demand its removal. I'm ruling in favor of the Homeowners Association." Greg felt the world crashing down around him as he watched his son's face crumple with defeat. The battle was over, and the Simmons family had lost. As they left the courthouse, Greg and Jason walked in stunned silence, the weight of their defeat hanging heavy in the air. Greg could see the anguish etched on his son's face, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow and disappointment. "I can't believe we lost," Jason murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've been through, after all the time and effort we put into this, they still managed to win." Greg placed a hand on his son's shoulder, trying to offer some measure of comfort. "I know, son. I'm just as devastated as you are. But we can't give up. Not yet." Jason looked up, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "What do you mean? What else can we do?" Greg took a deep breath, his mind racing with ideas. "Well, we could try appealing the decision, or maybe even taking this to a higher court. And we could rally the community, get people to speak out against the HOA's bullying tactics." Jason's brow furrowed in thought. "That's not a bad idea, Dad. Maybe we can get the local media involved. Shine a light on the HOA's abuse of power. They can't just steamroll over us like this and expect to get away with it." Greg nodded, a spark of determination igniting within him. "Exactly. We're not going to let them win without a fight. This isn't just about a barbecue anymore. It's about standing up for our rights as homeowners and members of this community." As they made their way back to their car, Greg could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was more determined than ever to take down the HOA and its tyrannical president, Karen. Over the next few weeks, Greg and Jason sprang into action, reaching out to local media outlets and rallying their neighbors to their cause. They held a series of community meetings where residents shared their own horror stories of HOA overreach and abuse. The momentum began to build, and soon the local news outlets were swarming the neighborhood, eager to cover the Simmons battle against the HOA. Greg and Jason found themselves at the center of a growing movement, with people from all over the community joining their fight. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to be growing increasingly unhinged. She made repeated attempts to silence the Simmons and their supporters, threatening legal action and even trying to have the barbecue grill removed by force. But each time, Greg and Jason stood their ground, their resolve only strengthening in the face of her aggression. As the public outcry continued to swell, the HOA found itself on the defensive. The city council and local government officials began to take notice, and suddenly, the Simmons' once quixotic battle had become a matter of public concern. Finally, after months of legal wrangling and intense public pressure, the HOA was forced to back down. Karen and her fellow board members were voted out, and a new, more community-minded leadership took over. The Simmons Barbecue Grill was allowed to remain, and Greg and Jason emerged from the ordeal as heroes in the eyes of their neighbors. As they fired up the grill for a celebratory cookout, Greg couldn't help but feel a sense of immense pride and satisfaction. They had won, not just a battle, but a war for the very soul of their community. And in the end, the Simmons family had emerged stronger and more united than ever before.